Hello, I'm glad you've joined us today as we continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Today we pick up in chapter 6 and verse 45, where it says, "Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the multitudes away. And after bidding them farewell, he departed to the mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were frightened. But immediately he spoke to them and said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid.' And he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were greatly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the instant of the loaves, but their heart was hardened." You'll remember prior to this, as we looked at in our last lesson, Jesus had just performed the miracle of feeding 5,000 men besides the women and the children. It was late in the day. Jesus makes the disciples get into a boat and go ahead across the sea toward Bethsaida. And he sends the multitudes away and goes up to the mountain to pray. John in his gospel tells us the urgency of this, as the people were wanting to take him by force and make him king. But he dismisses them and goes off to pray, having sent the disciples across on the sea. Again, we notice something very important, that is the time that Jesus spends in prayer. They were all very busy, and Jesus' popularity is high, and yet he takes time, even if it's going out to the mountain during the night and praying during the night. He goes and he prays to God. Jesus was God. He was God in the flesh. But Paul tells us, though he existed in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. That doesn't mean he wasn't God when he was here. Yes, he was God, but he didn't use the power as God for himself. He showed himself to be God in the flesh by the things that he taught and the miracles that he performed, but he never used that power for himself as a man so that he could set the perfect example living as a man here upon the earth. And we see that even in prayer. He spent much time talking to the Father, but when Jesus talked to the Father, though he had existed as God in the bosom of the Father before he came here, as a man, he spoke to God just like every man has to speak to God. Jesus didn't have a hotline to heaven, but when he spoke to the Father, he spoke to him just like we have to, and that's through prayer. And with the perfect life that he lived, spending so much time in prayer to God, they ought to tell us something, that we surely need to be spending much time in prayer to God. Here we see he goes up on a mountain to pray during the night, having sent the disciples. They leave, it's evening. They had come to that place for rest and relaxation for a little while, but that had gotten interrupted by the people. It was late in the evening when they get in the boat, and by the time they get out on the sea, it's dark, and the wind gets up, starts blowing against them. The other accounts of this, John states that the sea was getting rough. It was a strong wind blowing, he says. Matthew in his account says the boat was battered by the waves, and the wind was from the opposite direction. And Mark says it was against them. All of them stress the time of day and the place where they are at when this takes place. The time of day, it was evening when they leave, and by the time they get out there, it's dark, and they're not making much headway because of the storm, because of the wind. The place where they are when Jesus comes is if they're in the middle of the sea. It's not that they're close into land. Some have tried to say Jesus walking on the water was because it was just an illusion. He was walking close to the shore. No, it's in the middle of the night, and they're in the middle of the sea when Jesus comes to them. It says it's the fourth watch by this time, which would be 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., somewhere in there. Still way in the morning and it was dark. They'd been rowing for about 8 hours and had only made 3 or 4 miles. You say, well, how could you take that long to get across there? I've been in a boat before on a lake and had the motor go out and have to try to row, and a storm was coming up. And I want to tell you, you can row and not get anywhere. And sometimes it's even harder just to hold your own position. And that can be scary. It's frustrating. It can be fearful. I experienced that in the middle of the day on a lake. These men were experiencing something much more difficult in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the dark. And though these were seasoned fishermen, this was hard on them, and they had rowed and rowed and rowed, rowing against the wind, and only made just a little bit of headway. Jesus, it says, seized them. Verse 48, seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. It was about the 4th watch of the night. He came to them walking on the sea. He'd intended to pass them by. They are in need of learning that Jesus knows their needs even when he's not physically with them. And is that not a lesson we need? Sometimes we may feel that Jesus is not with us in certain situations, and Jesus may allow certain situations. Jesus had sent these disciples across knowing what was going to come. He'd intended to go and just walk past by them and probably get there before and meet them there, and by that miracle impress them and teach them something. But here, because he sees them struggling with this wind, he comes near to them rather than just going on past them. Sometimes the Lord may allow situations to come about that would test our faith, to show us that he knows, that he cares, and that he provides for us. Provides for us a means to overcome in whatever situation it is. That he knows where we are and how we're struggling. Verse 48 says that he was on the shore, and it's night. It's the fourth watch, and yet he sees. They're 3 miles out struggling. So how do you see somebody 3 miles out in the dark? Well, only God can do that. This was a miracle in and of itself. Here's the power and ability of God. This shows that Jesus has the ability to know every need. He is concerned about our every care. It doesn't matter what we're struggling with. It doesn't matter where we're struggling. And it didn't matter with them if it was 3 miles or 3 million miles. Jesus could see it. God sees and knows all things. And that's the point. He would appear to them first like a dark moving speck, and then as he gets closer, they say it's a human figure. And in this dark night, not dreaming that it would be their Lord, it says they cry out. Literally, it could be translate, they screamed out. It frightened them. Here comes something, it looks like someone, and it's on the water and it's moving right toward them. But as soon as he sees their fear, it says that he saw that they were frightened, and immediately he spoke to them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Those 3 words made all the difference. It is I. That wouldn't mean much if it was coming from anybody else. Anyone else speaking those words wouldn't give any comfort, wouldn't instill any courage. But this was coming from the Son of Man. This was coming from Jesus. And that's what makes the difference. He was God. And he would say in John chapter 8 and verse 58, before Abraham was, I am. This is who he is. Lest you believe that I am he, you'll die in your sins. Lest you believe that I am. This is who he is. He has the power over all things, even the power over nature, even the ability to defy gravity, to walk on water. The winds were still blowing. It was keeping the boat at bay. They'd only made 3 or 4 miles in 8 hours, and here comes Jesus, and he's just walking right along. He has that power. And because it's his voice, because of his word, because of his power, because of who he is, no matter how hard the winds blow, or no matter how the storms rage, no matter how dark things may get, because of his words, we can take courage. Because of who he is, we don't have to be afraid. That's the lesson they need to learn. It's the lesson that we need to learn. And as soon as he got there and got in the boat, it says that the wind stopped. Knowing that Jesus is with you and that he doesn't have to be physically with you. He saw their need 3 miles out and them in the dark. Jesus will come to us when we need him. He's always there for us. And if he is there with us in our boat, as we've talked about before, that makes all the difference. It is I, he said. Take courage. Do not be afraid. He has the power to calm any storm. He has the power to halt any wind. He has the means and the promises so that we can take courage and that we don't have to be afraid in any situation. We need to understand that Jesus is with us, and he wants us to cast all our cares upon him because he cares for us. The text says that they were greatly astonished. And again, it's an understatement. They were not realizing what they needed to, even from the previous miracles. And here's another sign of divine power. And they were impressed beyond measure. It says in verse 52 that they did not gain insight from the instance of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. How many of these miracles does it take for them to accept and expect by faith that Jesus is God, and realize his power, that he is with them, that he will see them through? Mark indicates that they are slow to learn and need even many such lessons. But we ought not be too hard on those disciples. Are we not slow in our faith many times? Are we not many times, as his disciples, slow to believe all that God can do for us and has done for us and the world through his divine Son, Jesus Christ? If we're not slow, then why is it that many times we're still afraid, and many times we're anxious, and many times we worry? And why is it that many times we don't spend as much time in prayer, seeking guidance and blessings from one who is all powerful? Has he not told us, just like he did them? It is I. Take courage. Don't be afraid. If we would just not harden our hearts, if we would just believe. Important lessons. You look at Mark chapter 6 and verse 53 here at the end of the chapter. It says, when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they had come out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about the whole country and began to carry out on pallets those who were sick, and to the place where they heard that he was. And whenever he entered the villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and entreating him that they may touch the fringe of his cloak. As many as touched it were being cured. He had sent them over toward Bethsaida, but now that he gets in the boat, they come to the land of Gennesaret, and they come ashore. Gennesaret is the name of a densely populated, fertile plain south of Capernaum. As you look at it, it measures about 3 miles in length. The Sea of Galilee sometimes is called the Lake of Gennesaret. And it's called that in Luke chapter 5, verse 1. It's a plain. It's about 1.5 miles inward from the shore. A lot of people live there, and as soon as he arrives, people recognize Jesus. Of course, his popularity is right toward its height. And they run through the whole country telling everybody, and they start bringing their pallets, and those who were sick bring them on those pallets. Just reminds us of the pallet that was let down through the roof earlier with the man who was paralyzed. They're just bringing people from everywhere, and every place that he goes, every city, every little town that he goes, they're just filling the place with people. And it's all kinds of people and all kinds of backgrounds with all kinds of problems, but they're coming to Jesus. Different levels of faith, but all who have a active faith find healing, even by touching the hem of his garment, as the woman did who had the issue of blood. They're finding the answers to their problems through Jesus. The Lord expects us to grow in our faith. He expects us to strive to have ever more perfect knowledge of him. But he's willing to respond to the simplest obedient faith. I think that's important to see in this. They were all kinds of people, as we said, all different kinds of levels of knowledge and faith. They would learn more. Even these apostles would learn more. But I think it shows us that you don't have to know everything before coming to Jesus. Some people think, well, I got to know everything about the Bible before I come to you. No. That your faith has to be perfect. Well, we've got to strive to perfect our faith and our holiness. But those who will come to Jesus with faith, with an active, obedient faith, will find healing. And we need to come to him. Our faith, our knowledge will grow as we study about him, learn about him, as we pray to him, as we strive to make his ways our ways, his thoughts our thoughts, will grow. But you got to start somewhere, and Jesus would have all come to him, and it shows us his sympathy and his mercy and his grace for all these who would come and find healing. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 6. We'll stop there in our lesson today before we get into chapter 7, where Jesus then will rebuke the Pharisees before he goes into his ministry in northern Galilee. I'm glad you joined us today. I hope you'll come back and study with us again. Until then, I hope you have a good day.